Han China today. See right there. It's a laser. It's working. Right, just testing it. Han China. How much of you all know about Chinese history? At all. Like, at all. Like, give me some hands. Well, Dana, what do you know?
They had a very well-developed bureaucratic system.
That's it. You keep that in mind. That's an amazing start. That's perfect. Anything else? Like ancient China, big deal. Or honestly, anything about China. Because we're going to tell a whole lot about China in the West. Hey, what do you know?
Genghis Khan.
Yeah, Genghis Khan conquered China as was part of many territorial gains. Yep.
A lot of dynasties.
Oh yeah, this one is one of the coolest. So the Han Dynasty. From around 200 BC to 280 was the equivalent to the classical era of the West, or a lot of people compare this, and I'm going to be doing it at the lesson, the Roman Empire. And of course, we're history majors, or at least, we all like history. Roman Empire is awesome. And I think China's awesome. And so now both, it's interesting. But first, because I very much doubt a lot of y'all know a lot about ancient China, because I didn't before I started studying this 2 months ago, I'm going to give you all a bit of context. Now, I'm not going to have you memorize this, don't worry. But when you're lucky, the Han Dynasty right there. It's kind of early in overall Chinese history. To begin is the Shah right there. This one is semi-mythical, or maybe fully mythical. We're not sure quite if it's real or not, because there's a lot of myth and fantasy kind of incorporated into it. Like, I mean, not actually, but imagine it's like, oh yeah, well the first emperor was blah 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 blah, and he had laser eyes, and it's floating in the clouds. Like, can't really take that as fact. But we do know the Shang, which came right after, was the first historical Chinese dynasty. Not a whole lot to talk about it. I mean, they had the first kind of written system, but it wasn't really until the Zhou and the Qin that China really started becoming, well, awesome, if I can say anything about it. And we're talking about those before getting to Han, because they're pretty important. Now, first, the Zhou dynasty. This is a long one. This is like over 600 years, and this was the formative era of Chinese civilization. Pretty much, if you can think of the West, how like Greece, ancient Greece would become like the formative era of a lot of what would eventually become Western culture. This is kind of like what the Zhou was. It was just unified. It was not like one centralized government, but a lot of the stuff that became Chinese started in the Zhou. Especially two things I'm going to list off. One, the Mandate of Heaven. Do y'all remember the Mandate of Heaven from school? Like this is in a lot of curriculums. This is like probably the biggest thing you'll learn from like Chinese history, like in high school, or whatever. Anybody know what the Mandate of Heaven is? Yep, Dana?
It's the idea that a king or ruler has the express approval of God or whoever your belief system is, and that therefore, they were chosen by God, so it's their right.
Yep. Cool. Perfect. And although that idea is in a lot of Western nations as well, especially in the Middle Ages, what made the Mandate of Heaven a little bit different is that it didn't just guarantee, I'm the head of power, I can do whatever, and with no consequence. The idea is that if you get overthrown or you do not follow up as your duties as a leader of the people, then whoever overthrows you they get the mandate. So you can lose the Mandate of Heaven. And that was a really key concept that would be brought up later in the Han. But something else really important in the Zhou. This would define all of Chinese history, a lot. There's 3 major schools of thought: Confucianism, Taoism, and legalism. Have y'all heard of Confucius at all? Anybody? Yeah, I thought so. He's pretty famous. And then there's Taoism. I mean, well, first of all, with Confucianism, I'm not going to go too deep into it because for the sake of time, but it's a philosophy all about basically what defines the morality and what's good and what's bad in China. It wasn't a religion, it was a philosophy. What was more religion was Taoism. If you can see right here, Taoism is the idea of yin-yang, that good isn't evil, and evil isn't good. Those two ideas, along with legalism, which is kind of like a strict a belief that the central government should have a lot of power, would rise and influence a lot of China during this first dynasty. Now next. The Qin. These people, I could make a whole lesson on this as well, and I almost know I did. But it's a little bit harder because these people only lasted for about 17 years. Now, the Qin dynasty was the first Chinese empire, completely. The previous dynasties, they were Chinese, and they technically had a leader, but they were not an empire because it was too decentralized and it had way too much squabbling. They would be petty kings to really be called an empire. However, it would change when this man right here, Qin Shi Huang, would come from the west and annex and unify a lot of, at the time, what was China, which isn't nearly as much as what it is now in modern day, but back then, it was still a lot of territory. Now, his empire did not last too long, because of brutality and decadence, but in this short reign, he was able to do a few things. He was able to implement some major reforms, or at least begin to implement major reforms, to centralize this very disjointed Chinese people group. He had legalism as the major belief system, as I mentioned earlier, because, again, he wanted the Chinese central government to be very powerful. He wanted it to be the head of everything, and the emperor was to be, the head, the emperor, not just some figurehead or whatever it was beforehand. Because this is the first emperor. That's literally what his name means. Qin Shi Huangdi, right? Qin Shi Huang, means first emperor of the Qin. And so he would do this, and he would do other things like create a common language and stuff. However, as I mentioned earlier, because of decadence and overall just people just not willing to accept the changes of having a centralized government, and because of how brutal he was with a lot of his implementations, they would fall quickly. Now, that was a good amount of context. But finally, we're going to get into the Han. But first, because the Qin are really important, and I just want to establish this, just in case y'all don't know who Qin Shi Huang was before this, I think y'all do. Because if y'all know the Terracotta Army, that's him. Because just like in ancient Egypt, these ancient Chinese peoples believed whatever that we died with and were buried with, we bring to heaven. So this guy, this warlord, conquered a lot of territories. Like, what thing, if I could bring one thing that helped me most in life to the afterlife, what could it be? Soldiers, a lot of them, a lot of people. I don't know what he thought he was going to do. I don't know if he conquered heaven or have his own little chunk out of it, but they put a lot of effort into making all these statues of individual people, all to go to heaven with him. Also, what the Qin would do, the Great Wall of China, they're not like this at the beginning, but they would start the beginnings of it, like to the northern border. It would eventually be built up later, but overall, the Qin, in their short little lifespan, did a lot. But who did a lot more is the Han. Oh my goodness, the Han. Oh, it's so cool. So, the Han Dynasty is the longest lasting Chinese empire ever. About 400 years long, and it was founded by this guy, Liu Bang. Liu Bang was originally a peasant. He was just some dude farming, just doing whatever. But eventually, in the later years of the Qin, and the destability of the empire saw a lot of these warlords and people to rise up. One of them was a man named Xiang Yu. He would get a lot of power quickly, but he wouldn't do much with it. Liu Bang, the second in command, who rose up from being a peasant to his high commander, would overtake him and would find the new Han Dynasty. And he would rename himself Emperor Han Gaozu. I'm going to keep referring to him as Liu Bang because I think the name's cooler, and I introduce him like that. But most people will call him Han Gaozu. Now, in the early years, the Han tried doing what the Qin would do, though in a much less brutal fashion. They tried unifying and making this central government much, much more powerful, so that they could keep power and actually have an empire, not just a confederation or just all these warlords. They wanted to actually have this last a long time. But they couldn't do it immediately. They tried doing some of the reforms that Qin Shi Huang did, but they couldn't just start and then okay, we're going to change everything. They had to do it slowly. So, what did Liu Bang do? Now you see, in ancient China, there's a lot of commanders and people who had a lot of territory and power. It's like feudalism almost. And these people were a threat to the emperor, especially in his early days when the emperor wasn't very strong. So what he would do, Liu Bang, made it to all these emperors, all these these lesser warlords, or leaders, he established it to where if one of them dies, instead of the inheritance going to their first son and all the power going to that, their inheritance is split up completely into a bunch of little fragments for each son. And then from each son, all of their children split up. So now these massive territories that were really hard to control, the central government, were breaking down farther and farther and farther into more grains of sand as opposed to big rocks standing in the way of the Han Dynasty. Now, on top of that, although he did implement this, it wasn't until eventually another emperor named Emperor Han Wudi, who's also really, really cool. Really cool. He did a lot. But he's like sixth emperor of the Han. It wasn't until Han Wudi that the emperor really started getting the power. If y'all know your European history, y'all I probably know that in the early Middle Ages, a lot of these kings that had power they didn't have all the power. They had some sort of limits, especially in England, the common law. But in the rise of somebody like Louis, like the 14th, the Sun King, where all the power started going to him. He had everything. He could do whatever he wanted. And that's exactly what Han Wudi would do. He wanted the emperor to be the master of all civil and military affairs. So anything he wants, he can do. Anything. And he did. And he did a lot with that newfound power, which I will mention later. But first of all, one last thing when it comes to the actual unity of China and like the kind of centralization that they really pushed for was the cultural changes. Now this wasn't really an intentional change, but it kind of came as culture was fostered, and that was the comparison of us towards them. If you all know Greek history, honestly, a lot of Western history, these ancient peoples were often referred to whoever wasn't them were barbarians. The Greeks, they would call Persians barbarians. Called Macedonians barbarians. That's what the Chinese did. People to the west, barbarians. They're less than us. They're not Chinese. People to the north, barbarians. South, barbarians. And so this kind of cultural unity that was formulated helped to, at least socially, have an idea of we are Chinese. But, guys, that was a lot. I know it is. It's going to be a lot more, too. It's a whole dynasty, a long one. But to give you all a little bit more perspective on what the Han really kind of did on a more practical level, is the bed stuff. They did a lot, actually. This is only some of it. I did not want to hold the whole list, explain all this, because they did a lot. But some of the major stuff was, first of all, paper. Now, in the West, they had paper equivalents like papyrus, but the kind of beginnings of modern paper that we use today, we all have computers now, but was from the Han, right? They also had sundials, which again, we don't really use that much anymore, but back then that's pretty sick. Being able to, tell what the time was without looking at the giant burning ball in the sky and go blind, that was pretty awesome. Seismographs. This is interesting. If y'all don't know what seismographs are, they are basically the early warning centers for earthquakes. We still use them now today, and very, very different. But the Han were able to invent like these devices that were able to actually detect earthquakes early. And this is important because China is one of the most active earthquake regions in the whole world, over 3,000 per year. And back then, this is almost 2,000 years ago, they were able to detect them beforehand, which is super important. Because earthquakes were not just some minor thing in China. It was everywhere. The whole idea, the architectural style of a lot of East Asian buildings with those curved roofs, pagodas, tall buildings, curved roofs. Those were built in mind to withstand earthquakes. This is a major part of their life, and the Han were able to detect them early with this invention. Lastly, crossbows. This one's a little interesting. This is actually not a guarantee if the Han invented the crossbow. Some say it was the Warring States period that came a little bit before the Qin. Some say it was the Han. Either way, the crossbow was improved a lot by the Han and implemented as a much wider scale for their army. And that will be important for later, because I'm going to be mentioning crossbow and why it's important in a later slide. But first, to kind of go off of the inventions, their innovations as well. Now, you see, I already mentioned earlier that the Han had continued the reform efforts of the Qing to unify the nation, and they did. That was pretty big. But they also did a lot more than that. The Han, as you guys probably can tell so far, began a lot of what modern China utilized later. Silk Road, the beginnings of it was founded in Han because they were able to expand their borders westward. They expanded in every direction, but westward in particular, and that allowed safe travel west, eventually go to India, then Parthia, and then Rome. And then these early trade routes would define a lot of AD, a land-based commerce. And it all started with the Han. I'm saying that a lot. You probably already can tell. It started with the Han. Another thing started with the Han is the establishment of the Confucian canon. Why is this important? Well, besides the fact that Confucianism was very, very, influential over China, it made it to where these early emperors were like, wow, Confucianism is pretty awesome. And it's very important for morality. So what we're going to do is establish some schools. Han will do this in particular. We're going to have schools and have it so people have to learn Confucianism so they can be in the government. Because we don't want, dumb people running our government that don't know, left from right. We want to know, upstanding people that know the Confucian dialects and can work well for us. This would be the beginning of the Chinese civil service exam and the meritocracy that would define a lot of later Chinese dynasties. So although the civil service exam did not start in the Han, it would begin here with these establishments of the schools and the idea that we need merit in our government to work for us. And by the way, in case y'all don't know, civil service exam was the practice of having bureaucrats be hired by the government based on their skill and not their blood, like whether they're noble or like peasants. And that's really important because this is ancient history. How many ancient countries can you really think of? They're like, wow, this dude right here, I know he's like peasant covered in mud and all that, but if he knows math, let's put him in government. No, it's like, oh, well, this peasant, it's covered in mud. Keep doing what you're doing, bro. Whatever. Yeah, keep making the wheat. I don't care. But the Chinese, surprisingly, will change that. Now next, I'm not going to stall this off. This is more so just for own reading, but just to give a little more context to things the Han did. First of all, they took currency, which is all just disorganized, all over the place. There's currency at this place, that place, different currencies, and they standardized it. Now China had a unified currency. And on top of that, they were so good at producing this new currency, people who tried making counterfeits couldn't keep up. They couldn't. They were trying to make, we're going to make fake money and sell that, put it in the economy. They were losing money because the Chinese were so good at actually making the real currency that they established, that the inflation that you would normally see with counterfeits did not even exist. Also, a little side note, this is a picture of Han Dynasty right here, the goat. He's awesome. Not the best looking fellow, but I guess, that's not too important when you're reforming all of China and making it awesome. Another thing that they did, and this is, I know I keep saying this, but I want you to keep this in mind as well, is a peasant army. This would begin in the Han, and it actually quickly stopped. But initially, the Han would have a draft-deep peasant system army, where they would take it, so every peasant, and there's a lot of them, a lot of people in China, always. It would grow more with agricultural innovation, but even back then, there's a lot of people. And they made it to where they all had to serve. Kind of like in Rome and in the early days, and a lot of these early states, every peasant had to serve in the army, 1 to 3 years. Let's have some upsides. Upside is, you got a lot of people, a lot of bodies to throw. You got a lot of people who just work on their farm all day, just throw them in the meat grinder. Just put them on the front lines, and whatever happens doesn't matter because they're peasants, who cares? That was great, well, at least for the leaders. But downside is that they aren't very well trained because they're only working for 1 to 3 years, and they're just chilling. They're here okay, can I go back to my farm now? It's like, nope, you guys want one more year. But I want you to keep in mind these large armies because they were able to conquer a lot of territory, especially under Han because of these large armies. Now, I'm gonna talk about this real quick. Actually, no, not real quick. This is about to be a lot. I'm gonna keep it level with you guys. This is why I made this lesson. So I started. This is just completely level ground. About 2 months ago, I started studying China. I didn't know anything about it. And I was going through all the early dynasties, and I was like, wow, this is all sick. Qin's cool, Han's cool. I was going through, this Han Dynasty is pretty sick. Then I got to the Han Zhuangzi War, and oh my goodness, I fell in love. It's so cool, and you guys are about to hear all about it. Now, who are the Zhuangzi? Can y'all guess? Nope, that's not Zhuangzi. Right there. Can y'all guess where Zhuangzi is? Up there, little picture, hints? Anybody? Come on, it's right here. I want to keep doing this till I see some hands. Somebody.
The guy on the horse.
Yes, it is. A little more detail. Come on. I'm on a timer. I can't do this all day. I want to do the activity. It's pretty fun at the end. I want to do this, but you got to tell me, what is that guy right there? What's he doing? Does it remind you of anybody at all? Any historical figure? People? Nothing? Oh my goodness. Okay. Yeah, Dana.
He's using a bow on horseback. He looks like what Genghis Khan and his soldiers did.
Yep, exactly. The Zhuangzi were horse archers. These were the first horse archers that we really kind of know of in history, at least to the extent of having an extended contact with an agricultural civilization. Why does that matter? Well, they were dangerous. They were really, really dangerous. Think about it. Every horse archer civilization that we've heard about it wasn't just like, oh yeah, we're just gonna go out, do whatever, have a little bit of land. No, they were bad. The Mongol Empire, second largest land empire in all of human history. the largest connected man empire in human history, I'm pretty sure. And why? Why are these people so dangerous? Why are they so effective? Well, these nomads did not have brick and mortar buildings. They would go around on their horses, and neighing around, just lollygagging in the middle of these fields, the tents, and they would just chill until they thought, okay, our neighbors over there in all these farms and all these tools and stuff, there's some things we like. So what they do, they would pick them. They go over and would raid these territories, such as the Han, and they would take a lot. And they were good at it. Because if you're on a horseback, you already have a massive advantage. Because, you have a, however heavy animal underneath you going a lot faster than you normally would, which is scary all of a sudden, but you also have a bow. So not only are you faster than your enemies, you can get in and out of battle quicker, you can go from battle to battle quicker, and you can charge through enemy lines, but you can shoot them before they can even attack you back. And these horse archers, especially the Zhuangnu and later the Mongols, were so much scarier because these weren't just people who got on a horse with a bow and okay, we're gonna go out and kill people. These people were born and raised in it. These were nomads. They did not have any other way of life. What they would do, they were born, they learned how to ride the horse and shoot the bow, and they did that their whole life. Even modern recreations of horse archery is nowhere near as good as what an average Mongol horse archer would have been. These people were bad, they were dangerous, and there's a lot of them. Now, the Han ended up fighting them. Because, I'm going to show you an image real quick. I'm going to go back to it. If you see up here in the north, Zhuangnu, or above them, modern day Mongol, just like the Mongols. And the Han would eventually fight them. How do you all think that would go? After everything I just said, who do you think would win? Don't look at this yet. I know I put this for you guys to read, but don't ignore that. Well, who do you think would win after saying all that? This super dangerous horse archer civilization versus the Han. Who would win? Guesses.
Personally, I think the Han just because they're bigger.
Well, guess right. The Han were able to beat them. How? How is it that these civilizations, such as Rome, such as the countries of China later on, and all over Asia, could not defeat the Mongols, Scythians, or Huns, or Parthians, and they got crushed by them, it's rolled over, but the Han in their first real engagement with these nomads were able to win. How? Well, there's a few things. One, Han Moody, he's the GOAT. He's the leader of the entire empire, and he was a very, very smart dude. And of course, other things that are kind of important in war, like good generals and stuff, who cares? But they employed some very, very unique strategies. I'm going to go over them real quick. This image real quick. Now, before I talk about that, originally the Han was just this. The south part was not part of the Han, nor was all that for that. So, in order to try and counter these Zhuangnu, who had these massive territories with nothing in them, what they would do, be like, hey, flanking is pretty useful in battle, right? Getting it behind your enemy is nice. What are they going to do? You shoot them from the side. And so Han Wudi was like, okay, let's flank them on a very large scale. All of this, the Hushi corridor in modern Xinjiang, and Manchuria right there, parts of Manchuria, it's not part of the Han. It was conquered for the express purpose of being able to have longer prong attacks from all of these different sides. So now these Zhuangnu were cornered, kind of cornered. They still had a lot of territory, but now they had a much larger area to defend. But if just conquering a lot of territory is enough to win a battle, win a war, then a lot more wars will be won just by people going around, kind of like what the Germans did in World War I with the sleeping plan. Did not work out too well, but for the Han, it did. No, I want to say you. Go back. The main thing right here. Remember how I said that they conquered the Hushi corridor, which is the northwest, right there. In this Hushi corridor, something happened called the Battle of Mobe in 119. This battle, oh my gosh, it's so cool. It is so interesting. So they had all these people, all these peasant infantry going up to fight these Zhuangnu horse archers, and they were outnumbered a lot. These horse archers, they were more dangerous, they were faster, they were more well trained, they had more range overall in every way, and there's more of them, and they're fighting in their territory. And the Battle of Mobe, the Han won because they implemented one strategy. See, where the Han live, not the Han live, the Zhuangnu live is in the middle of nowhere. They're nomads, they don't have buildings, they have tents, but really, they can't just wander around. And there's no great forest or anything to build stuff with or anything. So the Han, when they were marching forward on these supplies, they're standing in the middle of these open fields, the deserts or whatever, and they can't do anything. They don't have cover to defend against these horse archers who are pelting them far away and running circles around them. So what they would do is they innovated in the way that they took their war wagons, their carts they brought all of their supplies in, and they formed them into circles. Why is that cool? Or why is that significant? Because all of a sudden, in the middle of nowhere, can't do nothing, you now have a mobile fortress to fight and stop these charges that these horse archers have. And on top of that, people like crossbowmen or archers can now use the cover of it and actually shoot out at these horse archers if they're trying to charge them. This was crazy. I mean, it wasn't anything like massive. It's not like we went to the wheel. But the fact that they can now actually have cover in the middle of this battle, it would let them have the almost defensive advantage and push them farther and farther north. And they were able to beat them. Granted, with the hand of the Han drawing the war, this would not come immediately. But over years and years of continuous conflict with them, eventually they were able to completely fracture their civilization. The Zhuangzi Confederacy would split into a north and southern segment. In the south, they'd be like, okay, we're done. We're done. We'll be subservient to you. We'll do whatever. Okay? All good. The north, they wanted to keep fighting, and they got stopped badly. To the point where, we're leaving. They just migrated west. They just packed up the stuff and left. We have horses. We're nomads. We'll just go away. And they did. And what I find super, super cool is that there's a lot of evidence that these northern Zhuangzi that went west would eventually become the ancestors of the Huns of Attila fame. Meaning, if the Han did not defeat the Zhuangzi so well and so effectively, we may have ever had Attila the Hun and the Huns attacking the Roman Empire. Because these are descendants of these horse archers. Now, to give you a little bit of a break, not break, don't worry. You guys are about to listen to so much more. You're not going to need that. But a break in the Han was the Zin usurpation. Now the Han is 400 years, as I mentioned, longest one. But it's split in half by a slight kind of ad break where this guy, he was like cousin of the Empress or whatever. He was like, hey, the Empress was like, hey, I kind of want power. You want to come over and just take it? So this guy named Wang Mang, right there, to show him, took power. Kind of around the life of Christ, not exactly, but around. And for like 15 or 17 years or something, just kind of try having these reforms and stuff. And be like, oh, we're going to be more progressive and stuff. We're going to do more for the land and the peasants. And by doing that, basically means tripling the amount of monopolization the federal government has. So people didn't like him too much. And so pretty shortly after, he got overthrown and replaced with members of the Han Dynasty again and starting the next stage of the Han Empire. Now with this usurpation, you can kind of categorize the Han in 2 segments, the former and the later. The former, of course, being the first one, later being the second one. And the later Han was pretty cool too. I mean, I'm not going to list off a whole lot of things they did because some of the stuff I mentioned earlier, like their inventions, was in the later Han. And it was actually had even a golden age earlier on. It lasted quite a while, but it did not last permanently. Things started happening. They started really weakening this empire badly. On the national level, land reforms and taxation were so bad that a lot of these peasants were having all the little land that they took gobbled up by the rich. And now, all of a sudden, these rich were getting richer and richer and richer. And these peasants, by the way, the middle class didn't exist back then. So these peasants were already dirt poor, and it was getting even worse for them. And all the while it was getting worse for these people who were out in the fields toiling all day, and now kind of getting to more feudalistic, like a tenant cropping system of farming, the court was just shenanigans, just doing whatever. There's the court intrigue, people going around like, oh, I want power. No, I want power. The court eunuchs will be like, okay, we're going to try and scheme and try and get power from the emperor. And then the emperor's relatives like, okay, I'm going to scheme, try to get power from the emperor. And all these people would fight over this, and the emperor would just get weaker and weaker and weaker. Emperors were getting younger and younger. Eventually, they started getting assassinated. He became a figurehead of these other people in this court who were just completely just taking over. Kind of like parts of the Roman Empire, in which these weird Praetorian Guard were assassinating the emperors, and it was more a figurehead, while other people in the highest level of government were kind of controlling the puppet. Another cool connection. But that would not be the end of the Han. The end of the Han would come with the Yellow Turbans. Remember how I mentioned that like the peasants were like kind of upset at things that were happening? Just kind of. Well, they made sure that they were clear. They said, okay, we're done. That's it, we're done. We're gonna revolt. And revolt they did. Very, very big rebellion. Yellow turbans. All over the country. While the court was too preoccupied, like fighting each other, squabbling, this massive uprising across all of China, peasant uprising, rose up, but led by a religious zealot to try and take over or do whatever to try and get what they thought was just with land or anything in the government. Now, because this revolt was, as important as this was, funnily enough, it actually wasn't directly the cause of the fall of the Han. Not in the way you'd think. They did not actually win. They got crushed badly. But in order to crush the Yellow Turbans, what the Han would do, this disorganized, disorganized federal government that had no control over anything, they said, okay, we have no power here. These commanders that have control all over the Han, we're just gonna give them power. You can do whatever because we don't know what to do. We're panicking. So now all these commanders in their own jurisdictions would rise up and they would put down this revolt badly. But although the rebellion was squashed, new problem. What do you think is going to happen when a weak and squabbling central government just gave all of the power militarily to various commanders all over the state, in which troops are more loyal to them than the actual government? Because not only is the government just all just doing whatever, but these people, like these soldiers, were getting like their food, their money, all this from these commanders. What's going to happen? They're going to be loyal to Aaron.
Oh, okay. I was going to say maybe like a dispute for power or land.
Oh yeah, that's in like a lot of Chinese history. A lot of disputes, because these commanders were turned into warlords. All of a sudden, the Han had no more power. They had no more control because their whole military was divvied up under all of these different commanders all over the country that now have all these armies, and we're just gonna be like, okay, we're gonna fight each other now. Because frankly, why would we fight for this a failing Han Dynasty when we can just go over and take whatever we want, just raid other places, and just get rich? So that's exactly what they did. These warlords would branch out and kill each other a lot. And this would mark the fall of the Han and the beginning of many, many, many years of disunity in China. One of many times. But before I get into this kind of conclusion of the Three Kingdoms, I'm not going to go too far into it, just kind of like wrap up. I want y'all to think. I've said a few things about the Roman Empire so far. How the Han is like Rome of the East, it's like classical, has connection to Rome, like Attila the Hun, the Silk Road, other things. Does any Roman history fans here, do they see any kind of connections or thoughts about how giving power to these individual commanders and having troops be loyal to them, do any of y'all have any similarities you can draw to Rome? Yeah, Will.
First trial, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like early on in Rome, I would say Marius and Sulla, and later Julius Caesar and the First Triumvirate, that's exactly what the problem was. Is that these soldiers were fighting not for the state anymore, but for these commanders. And this is what caused the disruption and the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And just like in the West, things changed badly. Like, not exactly for the best. From here, this will start the famous Three Kingdoms era. I'm gonna be very brief with this, because this is just like, wrap up. Three Kingdoms is very famous because it's like, for a lot of Chinese people, it's like the perfect place for like fantasy. It's kind of like how in the Middle Ages for us, like knights and stuff, dragons and all that. The idea of like these three kingdoms constantly warring each other, which, by the way, were founded by these warlords commanders from the Han. It was very, very popular. And now, just to give you an example, because again, this is a lot. This is. Just to give you a small example, one of the commanders of the Han, Cao Cao, right there, he would be one of the ones that founded this empire up here, the Wei, and one of the three kingdoms. So just to give you perspective, these kingdoms were formed pretty shortly after the fall of the Han, and it would be conglomerated by killing all these other warlords, taking their territory, and there's only three left. And for many, many years, almost like the Middle Ages for Europe, with the fall of Rome, there would be no central unifying people or dynasty for a long time, for hundreds of years. But I'm going to give you a few further readings. Again, I learned all this in the past 2 months, and this is so interesting. And if you guys thought this was interesting, I know you guys are probably trying to like, oh my gosh, finish. I want to go to sleep, whatever. Break just ended. But if you guys do want to have some stuff, there's a few sources. Some of them are kind of smaller. Like this one right here is actually, I read this for Dr. Jones' class, Paired Civilization. And so it's a small little section. But other books like Mark Edward Lewis had a lot on the Qin and the Han. And so if you guys are, I'm going to leave this up for the activity, just in case you want to write this down, if you do. But I'm going to have you all do something hopefully fun. I think it'll be fun. But real quick, Dr. Jones, how much time do I have left?
Under 4 minutes.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I'm going to go around and pass.